I wonder for all of you to think not in terms of policy or projected policy, but what are the issues in that longer term? The pricing of energy resources, the pricing of food commodities, the pricing of value-added agricultural inputs, things of that nature are going to be the longer term issue that really drives the directions. So I wonder if you can each say something about your perspective on that.
In terms of the 5-year plan and uncertainty, I think, you know, a lot of the uncertainties that I addressed when speaking actually came from Chinese articles. And I think, you know, I see quite a bit of common analysis in those terms between, you know, those American and Western scholars who are analyzing the 12th 5-year plan and Chinese scholars, particularly with regard to this idea of economic transformation, whether or not it's going to happen, you know, constraints on urbanization, on environmental issues. A number of the papers are written by co-authors that are Chinese and American, and so I see a lot of common ground there in terms of, you know, concerns about the ability to implement this plan. With regard to the extent to which economic transformation is related at all to what we're talking about, especially to natural resources, and which is kind of the, you know, has been the driver of the relationship or the foundation of the China-Latin America relationship. It's absolutely related. The problem is that there are any number of you know, various scenarios that could play out, and so it's very difficult to, in a short period of time, to kind of go through each and talk about each of them. But I mean, let's say that what I foresee happening, and I'm by no means, you know, an expert or a soothsayer in this regard, but what I see happening is China not being willing to implement the sorts of difficult financial reforms necessary to really increase consumption as a share of GDP. I mean, consumption on its own has increased quite a bit, but consumption as a share of GDP, because there's tremendous political opposition, you know, at the very highest levels to doing this. They'll be able to strengthen their social safety net, but that's not the only issue, right? The income issue is huge. These financial repression is a huge issue. And so without doing that, the only way they're going to be able to really continue generating growth is through fixed asset investment. They're going to continue doing that, right? But what they do have in their pocket, and it's very clearly articulated in the 5-year plan, are these industrialization and urbanization efforts, which are also linked to, or in the plan at least, they very clearly describe them as being promoting of higher rates of consumption, because they provide more in the way of employment opportunity and increase incomes by transferring people from farms to urban areas, by you know, providing higher salaries in cities and so on. So what I see is, you know, that being the low-hanging fruit that is that China reaches for during these 5 years. And that being said, we're going to see a lot more in the way of you know, infrastructure development, a lot more in the way of rail, road. I mean, the numbers are incredible. And if you look at the 5-year plan, they have, you know, in English, they have these sort of lists of the goals, and
but that's all investment driven.
It's all investment driven, exactly. Yeah. It's all investment driven, and there's been no real indication that it's going to change, and because it's a very, very difficult change, and you know, and it requires a degree of political consensus that's not yet there. So, yeah, I mean, I see more investment-driven growth, specifically, you know, this sort of, we don't see it as much in the real estate sector now, but they're going to be doing all of this low-income housing, so, because they've put, you know, tried to dampen that intentionally. So, so they're going to boost it again with the low-income housing. It's an effort to kind of compensate for that. So it's interesting, and that means more in the way of imports of natural resources from Latin America, you know, construction specific. Now, if China is successful, that's a whole, you know, in doing that, that's a whole other question, and Kevin and Edward have talked about this a little bit already, but, you know, if they achieve higher incomes, and if they, you know, have a larger middle class as a result, then, you know, there's the whole there's a lot of talk about, expanding palates in China and taste for new foods, and people are eating more as they have higher incomes. And so, Latin America is an obvious destination for agricultural goods, especially when you're not able to produce enough domestically. And increasingly, it's fascinating. We follow all of the Spanish language news on China at the Dialogue. And I see report after report of, Chile, Peru, all of these countries sending delegations over to China to advertise wine and grapes and all of these, foods that have been consumed in China for years but are increasingly popular. Chocolate, coffee, huge. Just you see a real expansion, real diversification in terms of agriculture, and that would, if incomes increase as a result of this economic transformation or many of the guidelines in the plan, then we'll see more of that as well. So it's all it's all up in the air, and there are implications for every scenario.
I'll just answer the long run problem concern. Is that if you take the very long run, China accentuates an existing concern that has been the issue in Latin America over the long run, which is the concern of how to move away from commodity-based growth, especially in South America. That's why some, if you read the newspapers in places like Brazil, they blame China for their deindustrialization. But China, in a lot of ways, is the straw that it might be breaking the camel's back. Right, is that these countries have put too much faith in the short term and what they have a comparative advantage in now. And right now, the South Americans have a comparative advantage in all this stuff in the ground. Mm-hmm. And now you've got 1 billion people that want it, and so it's accelerated growth. It's shortened supplies of these things on the planet, and so it's increased the prices, and there's a growth bonanza in the region. That's a long-term curse, the resource curse or Dutch disease, that if it's not combated over the long run, the region could have serious long-run economic concerns. And I say they should take an example from the China playbook, because this is exactly what China debated 50 years ago, right? And China is the world's success story of a country that moved away from commodity-based growth to diversified industrialization, and now can build a better solar power plant than we can, have corner the market in wind farm, and in 2 years they'll be selling cars in the United States thanks to the new plants that they have in Mexico. I think the region can learn a lot from how China has diversified its economy over the past 50 years to save itself from the long run path that it might be in.
I guess I'll maybe comment also on that. So Nick Lardy just wrote a book on sort of how he views this shift, particularly in terms of access to finance, right? So the question of state access, is there some preferential, and there has been historically, preferential access to capital by state enterprises? To what extent have SMEs, to your question, been locked out of that capital? And also the extent, he has in there the extent to which there really is any green shoots of transition from this production-based society to a consumption-based society, and it's actually quite good. I think it's very different. He's taking a pretty hard line on, and a strong argument that he does see change, unlike other China watchers who've said that no, that we're seeing more of the same. So he actually sees there's a bit of a pivot. So there's a big debate that's, I think, about to be unleashed among the community in terms of to what extent is China starting to come up against certain constraints, particularly in terms of the ability of its state-owned system, economic system, to be able to diversify and do so in a competitive environment, right? Because that's the big difference. So a state-owned enterprise can create enormous amount of rents, which is what they've done when they're operating in a de facto monopoly or pseudo-monopoly, right? Whether it's a regional monopoly, in the case of like electricity company, or a national monopoly when you look at even oil and gas, a huge industry like that where 3/4 of the production is one company, right? So under those circumstances, you can create a lot of rent, and you can create a lot of capital, and you can create a lot of retained earnings. And what they're doing now, though, is they're trying to take a lot of that money off the table and put it out into the world. The question is, when you do that into the world, you then enter a very different, both political economy, as Kevin's saying, but also just a different competitive position because you're a newcomer. So I think that's where we're starting to see real questions about to what extent does this China model, to the extent it is a model, can it be exported, and can it be exported particularly into the developing world where the industrial structure is quite different. So I guess that leads me to say that in the long term, I'm interested to see what's going to happen, because I find that I'm baffled by the fact that one thing I spend a lot of time thinking about is you'd think that with 5-year plans, and you'd think that with long-term patient state capital, you'd think that there'd be a lot of risk tolerance, right, in that system, and particularly from the corporation perspective, that with negative return on capital, I mean, their capital rates are almost negative, effectively, right? So very cheap capital, plus supposedly the sage philosopher kings, right, in terms of their regulators and owners above them, where there's a lot of distance as well, that you would have outlays of capital in risky areas because you don't have, what you're saying, the quarterly return, short-termism, impatient capital of the West. But at least what I see is time and time again, and we're coming up with quantitative metrics to show this in terms of time to market of new technologies, even incremental innovation, let alone radical innovation, is I do not see them making those, being very risk tolerant. They're incredibly risk intolerant, right? And mostly because these state enterprises are run by people who are highly political, right? And are being they're being evaluated in very short term, through the very short term lenses. And so whether you're a consultant or a banker trying to sell them the bright new shiny toy, or you're the company trying to create the joint venture saying, here is you want to get involved because you want to move up the value chain, be involved in the last sort of almost the deployment phase, not even R&D early on. It's very difficult to get them to do so. And so I think that's what fascinates the hell out of me, is why is it so impatient when the capital is so different, the politics are so different.